Katherine couldn't believe what she was seeing when she returned from her business trip. The loud music was coming from her grandmother's house. This wasn't supposed to happen. She tried her key, but they had changed the locks. Her heart was already racing with fear. Where was her grandmother, Dorothy? She had to find her immediately. Katherine started banging on the door, demanding they let her in right now. Finally, her cousin Tyler opened the door, looking annoyed that she was interrupting his party. She pushed past him and rushed inside, her heart pounding with dread about what she might find. The house was completely destroyed. Where were her grandmother's precious antiques? Where was she? Grandma Dorothy! Grandma, where are you? Katherine screamed over the music, but no one seemed to care. Then she saw it. A small makeshift bed under the staircase, like something from a horror movie. Her grandmother was there, barely recognizable, thin and terrified, living like a prisoner in her own home. Grandma! Oh my God! What have they done to you? The sight of her broke Katherine's heart completely. Dorothy whispered with a broken voice. Katherine, they said you abandoned me. They took everything. At that moment, something inside Katherine snapped. The rage she felt was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. The party was still going on upstairs, as if nothing had happened, as if her grandmother didn't exist. Katherine marched into the living room and screamed, "Get out! Everyone get out right now!" The music stopped. Everyone stared at her, as if she was the crazy one for interrupting their fun. She immediately called 911 and then her lawyer. This wasn't just neglect, this was criminal abuse. Within minutes, police and paramedics arrived. The neighbors who had been ignored finally came forward. As they treated her grandmother, Katherine made a promise. Her family was going to pay for every single day of suffering. Where are you watching from? Please leave a comment and let us know what you think Katherine should do next. If this story is touching your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will leave you speechless. 3 days before the nightmare unfolded, Katherine was in her downtown office preparing for the most important business trip of her career. She had worked tirelessly for months to secure meetings with potential investors in Chicago, and this trip could change everything for her marketing consulting firm. As she carefully packed her briefcase with presentations and contracts, her mind was laser-focused on profit margins and growth strategies. She had no idea that while she was planning her future success, her own family was plotting something sinister that would devastate the person she loved most in the world. Meanwhile, Grandma Dorothy was spending her peaceful afternoon knitting in her favorite chair, the same burgundy armchair where she had sat for 30 years since Grandpa passed away. The living room was filled with warmth and memories. Family photos covered every surface. Her late husband's reading glasses still sat on the side table, and the scent of fresh-baked cookies drifted from the kitchen. Dorothy had no idea that this would be one of her last moments of peace in the home she had built with so much love and sacrifice. Katherine called her grandmother that evening to finalize the arrangements for her trip. "Grandma, I'm so sorry I have to leave for a whole week, but this could really help secure our family's future," she said, guilt evident in her voice. Dorothy's gentle laugh came through the phone. "Don't you worry about me, sweetheart. Your uncles will take good care of me. You focus on showing those big city folks what you're made of." Katherine smiled, feeling reassured by her grandmother's confidence, completely unaware that Uncle Richard and Michael were already planning something that would betray that trust in the most heartless way possible. That same evening, Uncle Richard and Uncle Michael were huddled around Richard's kitchen table, surrounded by financial documents and legal papers they had secretly gathered about Dorothy's estate. Richard's eyes gleamed with greed as he spread out the property deeds and bank statements. "She's sitting on a gold mine, Michael. That house is worth at least $400,000, plus all those antiques she's been hoarding for decades," he whispered to his younger brother. Michael nervously adjusted his glasses, still hesitant about their plan, but Richard's persuasive manipulation was already working its dark magic on his weaker sibling's conscience. Patricia, Richard's wife, entered the kitchen and immediately took control of the conversation with her cold, calculating demeanor. "We need to move fast while Katherine is gone. The old woman trusts us completely, and she's getting more confused every day," she said with chilling efficiency. She pulled out a folder containing power of attorney documents she had secretly prepared. Once we get her to sign these papers, we can start liquidating her assets. She'll never know what hit her. The three conspirators leaned in closer, their faces illuminated by the harsh kitchen light as they finalized their plan to destroy an innocent elderly woman's life. The next morning, Katherine arrived at Dorothy's house to say goodbye before heading to the airport. The two women embraced warmly on the front porch, and Dorothy's eyes sparkled with pride as she looked at her successful granddaughter. "You make me so proud, Katherine. Your grandfather would have been bursting with joy to see the woman you've become," Dorothy whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Katherine held her grandmother tighter, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and vanilla that always made her feel safe. She had no way of knowing that this would be the last time she would see her grandmother truly happy and free in her own home. Just 2 hours after Katherine's taxi disappeared around the corner, Uncle Richard and Uncle Michael arrived at Dorothy's front door with armfuls of flowers and grocery bags, their faces painted with fake smiles that hid their true intentions. "Dorothy, we're here to take care of you, just like we promised Katherine," Richard announced with false warmth, his voice dripping with manipulation. Dorothy's face lit up with genuine happiness as she welcomed them inside, completely trusting the two men who were about to turn her life into a living nightmare. Michael avoided eye contact, the weight of their deception already eating away at his conscience, but Richard's determination to execute their plan remained unshakable. While Dorothy busied herself in the kitchen making tea and sandwiches for her caring nephews, Richard and Michael began their systematic assessment of her valuable possessions. Richard's greedy eyes scanned the antique china cabinet, the vintage jewelry box on the mantel, and the original oil paintings that had been the family for generations. He discreetly took photos with his phone, already calculating how much money each item would bring at auction. Michael fidgeted nervously as he watched his older brother catalog their aunt's treasures like a predator sizing up its prey. But he remained silent, too weak to speak up against Richard's increasingly confident manipulation of the situation. By evening, Patricia arrived with a folder of legal documents carefully hidden in her oversized purse, her face wearing a mask of false concern and affection. "Dorothy, we've been thinking about your safety and security while Katherine is away," she said with practiced sweetness, her voice like honey hiding poison. She sat down next to the trusting elderly woman and began her manipulation. "These are just some simple papers to make sure we can help you with banking and doctor appointments if anything happens. It's really just a formality." Dorothy, overwhelmed by their apparent kindness and still mourning the absence of Katherine, began to consider signing documents she didn't fully understand, sealing her fate. As the evening grew darker, Dorothy found herself sitting at her dining room table, surrounded by Richard, Michael, and Patricia, with legal documents spread before her like a trap. The words on the papers seemed to blur together in her tired eyes, and the constant pressure from her relatives was making her feel dizzy and confused. "I don't really understand all this legal language," she admitted weakly, but Richard quickly reassured her with false confidence. "Don't worry, Dorothy. We're family, and we would never do anything to hurt you. Katherine would want you to be protected." With a trembling hand and a heart full of misplaced trust, Dorothy signed the papers that would give her nephews complete control over her life, her home, and her future. The very next morning after Katherine's departure, Uncle Richard and Uncle Michael arrived at Dorothy's house at 7 a.m. with multiple suitcases and overnight bags, claiming they needed to stay close to provide better care. "Dorothy, we've been thinking all night about your safety," Richard announced with false concern, his voice practiced and manipulative. "What if something happens to you while you're alone? We think it's best if we stay here until Katherine returns." Dorothy, still in her mourning robe and confused by their early arrival, felt overwhelmed by their sudden intensity, but couldn't find the strength to refuse their seemingly caring offer. Without waiting for Dorothy's full consent, the two brothers began moving their belongings into her home with an efficiency that suggested this had been planned for weeks. Richard immediately claimed the master bedroom, declaring that he needed to be close to Dorothy in case of emergencies during the night. "This arrangement is just temporary," Dorothy, but we need to be strategic about sleeping arrangements for everyone's safety, he explained while Michael nodded in agreement. Dorothy watched in stunned silence as strangers invaded the sacred space she had shared with her late husband for 40 years, but her gentle nature prevented her from speaking up against their aggressive takeover. Dorothy, we think you'll be much more comfortable in the smaller guest room, Patricia announced when she arrived an hour later, her voice leaving no room for argument. It's cozier, and you won't have to worry about climbing those extra steps to the master bathroom. The three relatives began moving Dorothy's personal belongings, her medications, her late husband's photos, her favorite quilts, into the tiny guest room that had been used for storage. Dorothy's hands trembled as she watched decades of memories being displaced, but when she tried to protest, Richard quickly dismissed her concerns. Trust us, Dorothy. We know what's best for your health and safety. By afternoon, the brothers had completely rearranged Dorothy's living room to suit their preferences, moving her late husband's favorite reading chair to make space for Richard's recliner that he had brought from his own home. They changed the television channel to sports programs that Dorothy had never watched, and Michael helped himself to food from her refrigerator without asking permission. We need to make some practical adjustments to improve the functionality of this space, Richard explained when he noticed Dorothy's distressed expression. These changes are temporary, but they'll make our caretaking duties much more efficient. Dorothy sat in the corner feeling like a stranger in her own home, but her lifelong habit of avoiding confrontation kept her silent. While Dorothy took her usual afternoon nap in the unfamiliar guest room, Patricia began conducting a systematic inventory of all the valuable items in the house, writing detailed descriptions in a leather notebook she had brought specifically for this purpose. She photographed antique jewelry, vintage china sets, original artwork, and rare books, researching their potential auction values on her smartphone. We need to know exactly what we're working with, she whispered to Richard as she carefully cataloged a set of silver candlesticks that had been wedding gifts. Some of these pieces could be worth thousands, and the old woman has no idea of their true value. Her cold efficiency in treating Dorothy's treasured possessions as mere commodities revealed the depth of her heartless greed. When Dorothy woke up from her nap, she experienced a moment of panic and disorientation as she found herself in the guest room instead of her own bedroom, where she had slept for decades. She reached instinctively for her late husband's photo that usually sat on her nightstand, but it wasn't there. The room smelled different, felt different, and the afternoon light came through the window at an unfamiliar angle. "Where am I?" she whispered to herself, her heart racing with confusion and fear. The sounds of her nephews laughing loudly in the living room reminded her of the morning's events, but the reality of her displacement felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. That evening at dinner, Richard began establishing new rules for Dorothy's daily routine with the condescending tone of someone speaking to a confused child rather than the woman who had raised him during his difficult teenage years. "Dorothy, we've created a schedule that will be much better for your health," he announced, sliding a typed paper across the kitchen table. "Breakfast at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 6, and bedtime at 9. No more staying up late watching those old movies or wandering around the house at night." Dorothy stared at the schedule with growing horror, realizing that these weren't suggestions but commands that would govern every aspect of her remaining freedom in her own home. As the evening progressed, Dorothy discovered that her nephews had taken complete control of the main living areas, forcing her to sit quietly in a corner chair while they watched loud sports programs and drank beer from her refrigerator. When she politely asked if they could lower the volume because it was hurting her ears, Richard responded with irritation. "Dorothy, we've had a long day taking care of everything for you. We deserve to relax and enjoy ourselves." Michael avoided eye contact with his aunt, clearly uncomfortable with their behavior, but too cowardly to stand up to his domineering older brother. Dorothy realized with growing dread that she had become a prisoner in her own home, and Katherine wouldn't return for 6 more days. When Dorothy attempted to call Katherine that evening to share her concerns about the new living arrangements, Patricia quickly intercepted the phone call with a smooth lie that revealed the calculated nature of their manipulation. "Oh, Dorothy, Katherine specifically asked us not to bother her with any calls unless there was a real emergency. Patricia said with false sweetness, while gently taking the phone from Dorothy's trembling hands. She's in very important business meetings, and we don't want to distract her from securing her future success, do we? Dorothy's heart sank as she realized that her only connection to the outside world was being systematically cut off, leaving her completely isolated and vulnerable to whatever her nephews had planned for the remaining days of Katherine's absence. That night, Dorothy lay awake in the strange guest room bed, listening to the sounds of her nephews drinking and laughing loudly in what used to be her peaceful living room. The moonlight streaming through the unfamiliar window created shadows that looked threatening and foreign, and she could hear them moving her furniture around and playing music that she had never heard before. Every sound made her heart race with anxiety as she began to understand that these men who claimed to be caring for her were actually taking over her entire life with a systematic precision that terrified her. As she clutched her late husband's wedding ring that she wore on a chain around her neck, Dorothy whispered a desperate prayer that Katherine would somehow sense that something was terribly wrong and come home early to save her from this nightmare. On the second morning of their stay, Richard and Patricia conducted a thorough search of Dorothy's bedroom while she was downstairs making breakfast, believing she was safely occupied. They discovered multiple jewelry boxes hidden in her dresser drawers, containing diamond rings, pearl necklaces, and gold bracelets that had been family heirlooms for generations. "Look at this, Patricia," Richard whispered excitedly as he opened a velvet box containing Dorothy's grandmother's emerald brooch. "She's been sitting on a fortune while living like a pauper. These pieces alone could be worth $50,000 or more." Patricia's eyes gleamed with greed as she photographed each item with her phone, already researching potential buyers and auction houses that would ask no questions about the origins of these precious family treasures. Behind a family portrait in Dorothy's bedroom, they discovered a small wall safe that contained decades of important financial documents, including property deeds, stock certificates, and bank statements showing substantial savings accounts that Dorothy had never mentioned to anyone. "My God, Richard, look at these bank balances," Patricia gasped as she spread the papers across the bed. "She has over $200,000 in savings, plus these stock investments that could be worth even more." Richard's hands trembled with excitement as he photographed every document, his mind already calculating how they could access these funds through the power of attorney documents Dorothy had unknowingly signed. "We need to move carefully and systematically. If we play this right, we'll never have to worry about money again." That afternoon, while Dorothy was taking her usual nap, Patricia made a series of discreet phone calls to antique dealers and jewelry buyers she had researched online, describing items without revealing their current location or her relationship to the owner. "I'm calling about some estate jewelry that needs to be liquidated quickly and quietly," she said in a hushed voice to one potential buyer. "The family wants minimal paperwork and immediate cash payments." Each conversation became bolder as Patricia realized how easy it would be to sell Dorothy's treasures without anyone asking difficult questions. "We can start with the smaller pieces to test the market," she told Richard later. "Once we establish relationships with buyers, we can move the more valuable items." Later that day, Richard sat down with Dorothy at the kitchen table, presenting her with a stack of official-looking documents that he claimed were necessary for her financial security and healthcare planning. "Dorothy, these are just routine paperwork that will help us manage your affairs more efficiently while Katherine is away," he explained with practiced deception, his voice warm and reassuring despite his malicious intentions. "This first document gives us temporary authority to access your bank accounts to pay your bills and handle any emergencies." Dorothy squinted at the complex legal language, her aging eyes struggling to read the small print, but Richard quickly guided her hand to the signature lines before she could fully comprehend what she was signing away. "I don't really understand all these legal terms," Dorothy admitted weakly, her voice trembling with confusion and exhaustion from the constant pressure her nephews had been applying since their arrival. "What exactly am I agreeing to?" Richard's response was a masterclass in manipulation. "Don't worry about the technical details, Dorothy. Katherine would want you to be protected, and these documents just give us the ability to help you in case anything urgent comes up." As Dorothy's trembling hand signed document after document, She unknowingly transferred control of her entire financial life to the two people who were planning to systematically rob her of everything she had worked a lifetime to accumulate. That evening, Tyler arrived at the house with cases of beer, party supplies, and a group of his college friends, announcing that he was going to liven up the place while they had access to such a large house. "Come on, Grandma Dorothy, you need some excitement in your life," he said with the casual cruelty of youth, completely dismissing her obvious discomfort with his plans. "My dad said it was okay, and we'll keep the noise down." Dorothy watched in horror as young strangers invaded her sacred living spaces, bringing with them the smell of alcohol and the promise of chaos that would shatter the peaceful atmosphere she had spent decades creating in her beloved home. As Tyler's friends filled the living room with loud music, drinking games, and raucous laughter, Dorothy retreated to the smallest corner of her own home, feeling like an unwelcome stranger in the place where she had planned to spend her final years in peace. The noise was overwhelming to her sensitive hearing, and the smell of alcohol and cigarettes made her feel nauseous and disoriented. When she politely asked Tyler to lower the music volume, he rolled his eyes and responded with stunning disrespect. "Grandma, we're just having a little fun. Don't be such a killjoy." Richard and Patricia watched from the kitchen with satisfaction, knowing that each party would further destabilize Dorothy's sense of security and make her more dependent on their protection. While Dorothy was distracted by the chaos of Tyler's party, Patricia took advantage of the noise and confusion to begin her systematic theft of Dorothy's most valuable jewelry pieces. She carefully selected items that she believed Dorothy might not immediately notice were missing: a pearl bracelet from the back of a jewelry box, a gold ring that had been tucked away in tissue paper, and a small diamond brooch that rarely saw daylight. "She has so much jewelry that she's forgotten half of what she owns," Patricia rationalized to herself as she slipped the stolen items into her purse. "We're not really stealing. We're just liquidating assets that she's not even using." Her self-serving justification revealed the twisted logic that allowed her to feel no guilt about robbing a vulnerable elderly woman. As the party grew louder and more chaotic, concerned neighbors began gathering outside to investigate the unusual noise and activity coming from Dorothy's normally quiet home. Mrs. Henderson from next door approached the front window and was shocked to see Dorothy sitting alone in the corner, looking frightened and overwhelmed while strangers partied around her. "That poor woman looks terrified," she whispered to her husband. "Should we call someone?" But when they tried to approach the front door to check on Dorothy's welfare, Tyler rudely turned them away, claiming that everything was fine and that Dorothy was enjoying the company. The neighbors left reluctantly, but their suspicions were aroused about what was really happening inside that house. That night, Dorothy lay in the unfamiliar guest room bed, clutching her late husband's photograph while tears streamed down her cheeks as the sound of Tyler's party raged through the house until the early morning hours. The bass from the music vibrated through the walls, and she could hear glasses breaking and furniture being moved around in ways that made her heart ache with worry about the damage being done to her precious home. "Harold, I don't know what to do," she whispered to her husband's photo, using the name she had called him for 50 years of marriage. "These people are supposed to be family, but they're treating me like I don't matter at all. I feel so alone and scared, and Katherine won't be back for 4 more days." Her tears fell onto the glass frame as she realized that her nephews weren't just taking over her house. They were stealing her dignity, her security, and her peace of mind piece by piece. By the 3rd day of Katherine's absence, Richard and Patricia had escalated their cruelty to an unimaginable level by forcing Dorothy to move her sleeping arrangements to the cramped space underneath the main staircase. "Dorothy, we need the guest room for Tyler's friends who will be staying over for the next few nights," Patricia announced with cold efficiency, as if she were discussing a minor scheduling change rather than forcing an elderly woman into subhuman living conditions. "This little area under the stairs will be perfect for you. It's cozy and private, and you won't be disturbed by any noise from our activities." Dorothy stared in disbelief at the dusty, cramped space that was barely large enough for a single mattress, realizing that her nephews were systematically stripping away every last shred of her dignity and humanity. The house had been transformed into a constant party zone, with Tyler's friends treating Dorothy's sacred home like a college fraternity house, showing no respect for her belongings or her comfort. Empty beer bottles lined the windowsills where Dorothy's plants used to sit. Pizza boxes were stacked on her antique dining room table, and strangers were sleeping on her couches and using her bathrooms without any regard for cleanliness or courtesy. The noise was relentless. Music blaring at all hours, people shouting and laughing, doors slamming, and the constant sound of footsteps above Dorothy's head as she tried to rest in her makeshift bed under the stairs. When she emerged from her cramped space to use the bathroom or get a glass of water, the party guests looked at her like she was an unwelcome intruder in her own home, making her feel invisible and worthless. Dorothy's physical condition began to deteriorate rapidly as Richard and Patricia implemented a systematic campaign of nutritional neglect that bordered on deliberate starvation. They had taken control of all the food in the house, claiming they needed to manage her diet for health reasons. But in reality, they were restricting her access to adequate meals while Tyler's friends consumed everything in her refrigerator and pantry. Dorothy, at your age, you really don't need to eat as much as you think you do, Patricia said with false medical authority when Dorothy asked for a second piece of toast at breakfast. We're helping you maintain a healthier weight and lifestyle. Dorothy watched helplessly as strangers ate the food she had purchased with her own money, while she was given small portions of crackers and weak tea that left her constantly hungry and increasingly weak. Patricia had established complete control over Dorothy's communication with the outside world, intercepting every phone call and preventing any contact that might expose their systematic abuse and exploitation. When Dorothy's longtime friend Margaret called to check on her, Patricia smoothly lied, "Oh, Dorothy is doing wonderfully, but she's napping right now. You know how tired she gets these days. I'll tell her you called." When Dorothy tried to protest that she was awake and wanted to speak to her friend, Patricia quickly ended the call and explained with false sweetness, "Dorothy, we can't have you getting overstimulated by too many phone calls. Katherine specifically asked us to limit your social interactions to protect your mental health." Dorothy realized with growing horror that her nephews had not only taken over her home and stolen her belongings, but they had also cut off her connections to every person who might be able to help her escape this nightmare. Richard and Patricia had become increasingly bold in their theft and sale of Dorothy's most precious possessions, meeting with antique dealers and jewelry buyers in parking lots and coffee shops to conduct cash transactions that left no paper trail. We're representing an elderly family member who needs to liquidate some assets for medical expenses, Richard explained to buyers with practiced deception, his story becoming more elaborate with each transaction. They had already sold Dorothy's grandmother's pearl necklace, her wedding china set, and several valuable paintings that had hung in her living room for decades, replacing them with cheap reproductions that they hoped she wouldn't notice in her increasingly confused and weakened state. The cash from these sales was being deposited into accounts that Richard had secretly opened using the power of attorney documents Dorothy had been tricked into signing. When Dorothy noticed that several of her most cherished possessions had disappeared, including her mother's silver tea service and her husband's vintage watch collection, Richard and Patricia responded with a coordinated campaign of gaslighting that made her question her own memory and sanity. "Dorothy, you donated those items to charity last month. Don't you remember?" Patricia said with false patience, her voice taking on the condescending tone used to speak to someone with dementia. "You said you wanted to simplify your life and help people less fortunate than yourself." When Dorothy insisted that she would never have given away her husband's watches, Richard added his voice to the manipulation. "And Dorothy, your memory has been getting a little fuzzy lately. Maybe you should write things down so you don't forget the decisions you've made." Their systematic undermining of her confidence in her own memory was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their abuse, making Dorothy doubt everything she thought she knew about her own life and choices. The concerned neighbors who had witnessed the ongoing chaos at Dorothy's house made several attempts to check on her welfare, but Tyler had been instructed by his father to turn away any visitors with a variety of creative excuses. When Mrs. Henderson from next door brought over a casserole and asked to see Dorothy, Tyler blocked the doorway and said, Grandma Dorothy is having a bad day today and can't have visitors. Dad says she's been getting confused and agitated around strangers. When the mailman asked why Dorothy hadn't been collecting her mail from the mailbox, Tyler claimed she was recovering from a minor illness and that the family was handling everything for her. Each lie became more elaborate as Tyler learned to manipulate the concerns of caring neighbors, effectively isolating Dorothy from anyone who might have been able to recognize the abuse and call for help. The nightly parties had become Dorothy's greatest source of terror and despair, as she lay curled up in her makeshift bed under the staircase, while dozens of strangers partied directly above her head until the early morning hours. The bass from the music vibrated through the wooden stairs above her, making the small space feel like it was shaking apart, while the sound of footsteps, shouting, and breaking glass created a constant atmosphere of chaos and fear. Dorothy would cover her ears with her thin pillow and whisper prayers that she had learned as a child, begging God to either end her suffering or bring Katherine home early to rescue her from this living nightmare. The smell of alcohol, cigarettes, and vomit often drifted down to her cramped space, making her nauseous and dizzy, while the party guests would sometimes use the area near the stairs as a bathroom when the regular facilities were occupied, forcing Dorothy to endure the additional humiliation of unsanitary conditions. When the noise complaints from neighbors finally prompted a police visit to Dorothy's house, Richard was prepared with a carefully crafted story that portrayed the family as caring relatives dealing with a difficult elderly woman who was becoming increasingly confused and paranoid. "Officer, we're so sorry about the noise," Richard said with perfect sincerity, his voice full of false regret and concern. "We're caring for my elderly aunt while her granddaughter is out of town, and we've been trying to keep her spirits up with some family gatherings. She's been going through a difficult time since her health started declining." The officer, faced with no obvious signs of criminal activity and a seemingly reasonable explanation, simply warned them to keep the noise down and left without investigating further, unaware that he had just walked away from a scene of systematic elder abuse that was escalating toward life-threatening neglect. By the end of the week, Dorothy had become so physically and emotionally broken that she could barely summon the strength to climb out of her cramped space under the stairs, even to use the bathroom or get the minimal food that Patricia allowed her to have. Her once bright eyes had become dull and unfocused. Her hands trembled constantly from malnutrition and stress, and her voice had been reduced to weak whispers that no one bothered to listen to over the constant noise of the ongoing parties. She had begun talking to her late husband's spirit as if he were sitting beside her in the darkness, begging him to take her away from this nightmare or to somehow bring Katherine home before it was too late. "Harold, I don't think I can survive much longer like this," she whispered into the darkness as another party raged above her head. "They're killing me slowly, and I don't have the strength to fight them anymore. Please, if you can hear me, please find a way to save me before they destroy everything we built together." Her words were lost in the chaos of music and laughter that filled the house where she had once been the beloved matriarch, but was now treated worse than an unwanted animal. Katherine carefully lifted her grandmother's frail body from the cramped space under the stairs, her heart breaking as she felt how much weight Dorothy had lost in just 1 week. "Grandma, I'm here now. You're safe. I'm going to get you out of this nightmare," she whispered through her tears, cradling the woman who had raised her like a daughter. Dorothy's eyes fluttered open weakly, and she reached up with a trembling hand to touch Katherine's face as if she couldn't believe her granddaughter was real. "Katherine, my sweet child, I thought I was going to die here," Dorothy whispered, her voice so weak that Katherine had to lean down to hear her over the party music that was still blaring in the background. The sight of her beloved grandmother reduced to this broken, terrified shell of herself filled Katherine with a rage so pure and powerful that she could feel it burning in her chest like a physical flame. Katherine carried Dorothy into the main living room where Tyler's party was still in full swing, her anger building to explosive levels as she saw strangers drinking beer and laughing while her grandmother had been suffering in unimaginable conditions just feet away from them. "Everybody out now!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cutting through the music like a knife. "Get out of this house immediately. or "I'm calling the police." The party guests looked at her with confusion and annoyance, clearly seeing her as an unwelcome killjoy rather than understanding that they had been unknowing participants in a scene of elder abuse. Tyler emerged from the kitchen with a beer in his hand, his face showing irritation rather than shame as he realized that his free party house had just been shut down by Katherine's unexpected early return. Richard and Patricia rushed into the living room when they heard Katherine shouting, their faces carefully arranged in expressions of fake surprise and concern as they attempted to take control of the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Katherine, what are you doing here so early? We weren't expecting you until tomorrow," Richard said with forced cheerfulness, as if finding his aunt living under the stairs was a minor misunderstanding rather than evidence of systematic abuse. "We've been taking such good care of Dorothy, but she's been having some difficult days lately. Her memory has been getting a bit confused, and she's been making some strange choices about where she wants to sleep." Patricia nodded in agreement, adding with false sympathy, "We've been so worried about her mental state. She's been refusing to stay in the comfortable guest room we prepared for her and insisting on sleeping in odd places around the house." Katherine gently placed Dorothy on the couch and then turned to face her uncles with an expression of rage that made both men take an involuntary step backward. "Don't you dare try to gaslight me about what I just found," she screamed, her voice filled with a fury that seemed to shake the walls of the house. "My grandmother was living under the stairs like a prisoner. She's obviously malnourished, and this house has been turned into a party zone for your worthless son and his friends. What kind of monsters are you?" Her words came out in a torrent of righteous anger as she cataloged everything she could see wrong with the scene around her. "Look at her. Look at what you've done to a 78-year-old woman who trusted you with her life. She can barely lift her head. She's lost at least 20 pounds, and she's terrified of her own family." As Katherine's eyes swept around the living room, she began to notice that many of Dorothy's most precious possessions were simply gone, leaving obvious empty spaces on walls and shelves where family heirlooms had sat for decades. "Where's my grandmother's china cabinet? Where are the silver candlesticks that belonged to my great-grandmother? Where's the oil painting that hung over the fireplace for 30 years?" she demanded, her voice rising with each missing item she discovered. The scope of the theft became clear as she realized that Richard and Patricia hadn't just been neglecting Dorothy's physical needs. They had been systematically looting her home of everything valuable while she was too weak and confused to stop them. "You didn't just abuse her. You robbed her blind while she was suffering under your so-called care." Richard and Patricia exchanged nervous glances before launching into a coordinated series of lies that revealed how extensively they had planned their defense against exactly this type of confrontation. "Katherine, you're misunderstanding the situation completely," Richard said with false calm, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he had perfected over years of manipulation. "Dorothy asked us to help her simplify her life by selling some of the items she no longer needed. She wanted to liquidate some assets to ensure she had enough money for her healthcare needs." Patricia quickly added her own fabricated details. She was very specific about wanting to downsize her possessions. "We have all the paperwork showing that she consented to these sales. We were just following her wishes and trying to help her prepare for the future." Their lies were delivered with such practiced confidence that Katherine realized this wasn't a spontaneous abuse situation. It was a carefully orchestrated plan to steal everything Dorothy owned. Katherine immediately pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice steady and clear despite the rage that was burning inside her as she spoke to the emergency dispatcher. "I need police and paramedics at 1247 Maple Street immediately. I've just discovered that my 78-year-old grandmother has been the victim of elder abuse and theft by family members who were supposed to be caring for her." She kept one protective hand on Dorothy's shoulder while she spoke, making sure her grandmother could hear that help was finally coming. "She's been forced to live in subhuman conditions. She appears to be malnourished and dehydrated, and valuable items have been stolen from her home. I need officers here right away because the perpetrators are still on the premises, and I'm concerned they might try to leave or destroy evidence." Her calm, Factual reporting of the situation demonstrated that her initial explosion of rage had crystallized into cold, calculating determination to see justice done. When Richard realized that Katherine had called the police, he immediately tried to gather his belongings and leave the house before authorities arrived. But Katherine positioned herself between him and the front door with the fierce determination of a protective lioness. "You're not going anywhere until the police get here and sort this out," she declared, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. "You're going to face the consequences of what you've done to my grandmother, and you're going to return every single item you stole from her." Richard's facade of calm control finally cracked as he realized that his carefully planned theft and abuse scheme was collapsing around him. "Katherine, you're being hysterical and dramatic. We can work this out as a family without involving outside authorities," he pleaded, but his desperation only confirmed Katherine's suspicions about the extent of his criminal behavior. Patricia began frantically gathering documents and paperwork that were scattered around the house, stuffing bank statements, property deeds, and power of attorney papers in her oversized purse with the panicked movements of someone trying to destroy evidence before police arrived. "Patricia, where are those papers you're trying to hide?" Katherine demanded, moving quickly to intercept her aunt before she could conceal more evidence of their crimes. "Those documents belong to my grandmother, and if you've been using them to steal from her, that's going to be part of the criminal charges you're facing." Patricia's face had gone pale with fear as she realized that all their careful planning and legal manipulation meant nothing if Katherine could prove they had obtained Dorothy's signatures through deception and coercion. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance made her movements even more frantic as she tried to hide the evidence of months of financial fraud and theft. Within minutes, the quiet suburban street was filled with the flashing lights of police cars and an ambulance, as Katherine's call for help brought the full weight of law enforcement to Dorothy's front door. Neighbors who had been concerned about the ongoing chaos at the house for days finally felt vindicated as they watched officers approach the front door with serious expressions and official authority. Katherine felt a surge of relief and satisfaction as she realized that her grandmother's nightmare was finally coming to an end, and that the people responsible for this systematic abuse were about to face real consequences for their actions. "Help is here, Grandma," she whispered to Dorothy, squeezing her frail hand gently. "These people are never going to hurt you again, and we're going to make sure they pay for everything they've done to you." The arrival of professional help marked the beginning of Dorothy's rescue and the end of Richard and Patricia's reign of terror. But Katherine knew that the real work of healing and seeking justice was just beginning. Before leaving for the hospital with Dorothy, Katherine systematically documented every piece of evidence she could find throughout the house, using her phone to photograph the horrific living conditions her grandmother had been forced to endure. She took pictures of the cramped space under the stairs where Dorothy had been sleeping, the empty walls where valuable paintings had hung, the overflowing trash from Tyler's parties, and the general state of neglect and chaos that had consumed what was once a pristine home. "I'm documenting everything," she told the police officers who were already beginning their investigation. "This isn't just neglect. This is systematic abuse and theft, and I want every detail preserved as evidence." Her methodical approach to gathering proof demonstrated that her emotional devastation had been channeled into cold, calculating determination to ensure that justice would be served and that Richard and Patricia would face the full consequences of their criminal behavior. At Mercy General Hospital, the emergency room staff immediately recognized the signs of severe elder abuse as they examined Dorothy's frail condition and documented her obvious malnutrition, dehydration, and psychological trauma. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending physician, spoke with Katherine in hushed, serious tones as she explained the extent of Dorothy's physical deterioration. "Your grandmother is severely malnourished and dehydrated, which suggests prolonged nutritional neglect. She's lost approximately 25 pounds. Her blood pressure is dangerously low, and she's showing signs of chronic stress that could have long-term health implications." The doctor's professional assessment confirmed Katherine's worst fears about the systematic nature of the abuse. We're going to need to keep her for several days to stabilize her condition and run comprehensive tests to assess any permanent damage that may have been caused by this neglect. Dr. Walsh sat down with Katherine in a private consultation room to review the comprehensive medical evaluation that revealed the full scope of Dorothy's suffering during her week under Richard and Patricia's so-called care. The blood tests show signs of chronic malnutrition that developed over several days, not weeks or months, the doctor explained, her voice filled with professional concern and personal anger. This means the neglect was recent and severe. She also has bruising on her arms and legs that suggests she may have been handled roughly or fallen due to weakness. Most concerning is her psychological state. She's exhibiting symptoms of trauma and depression that are consistent with prolonged emotional abuse. Katherine felt her rage intensifying as each medical finding provided more evidence that her grandmother's suffering had been deliberate and calculated rather than the result of mere negligence or misunderstanding. The next morning, Katherine met with Robert Martinez, one of the city's most respected elder law attorneys, to discuss the legal implications of what had happened to Dorothy and to explore every possible avenue for criminal and civil prosecution. Based on what you've described and the medical evidence, we're looking at multiple felony charges including elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, and theft. Attorney Martinez explained as he reviewed the photographs and medical reports Katherine had brought. The power of attorney documents they tricked your grandmother into signing were obtained through deception and coercion, which makes them legally invalid. We can prove that they used fraudulent means to gain access to her finances and property. Katherine listened intently as the attorney outlined a comprehensive legal strategy that would not only seek criminal prosecution, but also civil damages that could force Richard and Patricia to return everything they had stolen and pay for Dorothy's medical care and emotional suffering. As Attorney Martinez helped Katherine review Dorothy's bank statements and financial records, the true extent of Richard and Patricia's theft became staggeringly clear, revealing a systematic looting operation that had drained thousands of dollars from Dorothy's accounts in just 1 week. They withdrew over $15,000 in cash using the fraudulent power of attorney, the attorney said, pointing to a series of large withdrawals that had been made while Katherine was out of town. They also sold at least $25,000 worth of antiques and jewelry based on the appraisal values we have from your grandmother's insurance records. Katherine stared at the financial documents in disbelief as she realized that Richard and Patricia hadn't just been cruel. They had been running a sophisticated theft operation that could have left Dorothy completely destitute if Katherine hadn't returned when she did. We need to freeze all her accounts immediately and file criminal charges before they can steal anything else, she demanded. That evening, Katherine made a decision that would change everything. She was going to expose Richard and Patricia's crimes to the entire community through social media, ensuring that their reputations would be destroyed along with their freedom. She carefully crafted a detailed Facebook post that included photographs of Dorothy's living conditions, medical reports documenting the abuse, and a comprehensive account of everything that had happened during her business trip. This is my 78-year-old grandmother, Dorothy, who was systematically abused and robbed by my uncles Richard and Michael Patterson, along with Richard's wife, Patricia, she wrote in a post that would soon go viral throughout their city. While I was away on a business trip, these people forced my grandmother to live under the stairs of her own home, stole thousands of dollars from her accounts, and sold her family heirlooms for cash. I want everyone in our community to know exactly what kind of people they are. Within hours of posting her story, Katherine's social media account exploded with activity as friends, neighbors, and complete strangers began sharing her post and expressing their outrage at the treatment Dorothy had received from her own family members. The post was shared over 500 times in the first 6 hours, with comments ranging from expressions of support for Dorothy to demands that Richard and Patricia face the harshest possible legal consequences. "I can't believe people like this exist," wrote one commenter. "That poor woman trusted them with her life, and they treated her worse than an animal." Local news outlets began contacting Katherine for interviews after seeing the viral post, and she realized that her decision to expose the abuse publicly was going to have consequences far beyond what she had initially imagined. When Channel 7 News contacted Katherine for an on-camera interview about Dorothy's case, she immediately agreed, knowing that media attention would put additional pressure on law enforcement to take the charges seriously and would warn other families about the signs of elder abuse. I want people to understand that elder abuse can happen to anyone, even people with loving families who are just temporarily unable to provide direct supervision, Katherine told reporter Sarah Chun during their phone conversation. My grandmother is an intelligent, capable woman who was systematically manipulated and abused by people she trusted completely. If this can happen to her, it can happen to anyone's elderly relatives. Katherine's decision to speak publicly about the case demonstrated her commitment to seeking justice not just for Dorothy, but for all elderly people who might be vulnerable to similar abuse from trusted family members. Back at the hospital, Dorothy's physical condition had begun to improve dramatically under proper medical care, and her mental clarity was returning as the fog of malnutrition and trauma started to lift. Katherine, I can't believe they did all those things to me, Dorothy said, her voice stronger than it had been since Katherine's return. I trusted them completely, and they made me feel like I was losing my mind when I questioned what was happening. Katherine held her grandmother's hand gently as they talked about the legal proceedings that were beginning and the media attention that was bringing community support for Dorothy's recovery. Grandma, we're going to make sure they pay for everything they did to you, and we're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else, Katherine promised. You're safe now, and you're never going to have to see those people again unless it's in a courtroom where they're being held accountable for their crimes. As Katherine and Attorney Martinez prepared to file formal criminal charges against Richard, Patricia, and Michael, they were surrounded by local media crews who had been following the story since Katherine's social media post went viral. We're filing charges of elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, theft, and conspiracy, Attorney Martinez announced to the gathered reporters. This case represents one of the most systematic examples of elder abuse our office has ever seen, and we intend to prosecute it to the fullest extent of the law. Katherine stood beside her attorney with quiet confidence, knowing that her decision to expose the abuse publicly had created a groundswell of community support that would make it impossible for Richard and Patricia to escape justice. My grandmother deserves to have her dignity restored and her property returned, she told the cameras. But more importantly, other families need to know that this kind of abuse will not be tolerated in our community, and that there will be serious consequences for anyone who preys on vulnerable elderly people. Within 48 hours of Katherine's initial social media post, the story of Dorothy's abuse had spread far beyond their immediate community, generating over 10,000 shares across multiple platforms and attracting attention from regional news outlets throughout the state. Local Facebook groups were flooded with comments from people sharing their own experiences with elder abuse, and the hashtag Justice for Dorothy began trending on Twitter as people demanded accountability for Richard and Patricia's crimes. I never expected this level of response, Katherine told a reporter from the Springfield Herald. But I'm grateful that Dorothy's story is resonating with so many people because it means other families will be more aware of the warning signs of elder abuse. The viral nature of the story had transformed a local criminal case into a statewide conversation about the vulnerability of elderly people and the need for stronger protections against family members who exploit their trust. Mrs. Henderson, Dorothy's longtime next-door neighbor, became one of the most powerful voices supporting Katherine's account when she spoke to Channel 7 News about her attempt to check on Dorothy during the week of abuse. I knew something was wrong from the very first day those men moved into Dorothy's house, she told reporter Sarah Chun, her voice filled with regret and anger. The noise, the strangers coming and going, the smell of alcohol and cigarettes. It was completely unlike Dorothy to allow that kind of chaos in her home. Mrs. Henderson revealed that she had tried multiple times to visit Dorothy, but had been turned away by Tyler with increasingly elaborate excuses about Dorothy's health and mental state. I called the police twice about the noise, but they were told it was just family gatherings to help Dorothy feel less lonely. Now I realized we were watching a crime in progress and didn't know how to stop it, Dorothy's longtime friends from the senior center came forward in a coordinated effort to support Katherine's case and provide character testimony about the kind of person Dorothy had always been before her nephews took control of her life. Dorothy has been one of our most active and mentally sharp members for over 15 years, explained Margaret Foster, who had been Dorothy's friend since they were both young mothers. She volunteers at our food bank, helps organize our charity drives, and never misses our weekly book club meetings. The idea that she would voluntarily live under a staircase or sign away her property rights is absolutely ridiculous. The group presented Katherine with detailed records showing Dorothy's regular participation in community activities right up until the week Katherine left for her business trip, providing clear evidence that Dorothy's mental faculties had been completely intact before Richard and Patricia began their systematic manipulation and abuse. The viral nature of Katherine's social media campaign had immediate professional consequences for Richard when his employer, Midwest Financial Services, discovered that one of their senior loan officers was facing multiple felony charges for elder abuse and theft. We became aware of the serious criminal allegations against Mr. Patterson through social media and news reports, explained company spokesperson Jennifer Walsh in a prepared statement. Given the nature of these charges and our company's commitment to ethical behavior, we have terminated Mr. Patterson's employment effective immediately. Richard's 20-year career in banking came to an abrupt end as he was escorted from the building by security guards while his former colleagues watched in shock and disgust. The loss of his six-figure salary would make it even more difficult for him to pay for the legal defense he would need to fight the mounting criminal charges. The local community organized a support rally for Dorothy at the Maple Street Community Center, drawing over 200 people who wanted to show their solidarity with Katherine's fight for justice and their commitment to protecting elderly residents from similar abuse. What happened to Dorothy Patterson could happen to any of our elderly neighbors if we don't stay vigilant and involved in each other's lives, declared community organizer Linda Rodriguez as she addressed the crowd. We need to make sure that people like Richard and Patricia Patterson understand that our community will not tolerate elder abuse, and that we will support the victims and their families in seeking full accountability. The rally featured speakers from local senior advocacy groups, law enforcement officials, and family members who had dealt with similar cases of elder abuse, creating a powerful coalition of support that would continue to pressure authorities to prosecute the case aggressively. Patricia found herself trapped in her own home as news crews and reporters camped outside, waiting for any opportunity to get a statement from the woman who had been identified as one of the primary perpetrators in Dorothy's systematic abuse. "Mrs. Patterson, do you have any comment about the charges against you?" shouted reporters whenever she attempted to leave her house, forcing her to sneak out through her backyard and drive her car through alleyways to avoid the media attention. Her attempts to maintain a low profile were unsuccessful as her photograph from Katherine's social media post had been shared thousands of times, making her face recognizable throughout the community. Former friends and neighbors began sharing their own stories about Patricia's manipulative behavior over the years, painting a picture of a woman who had a long history of taking advantage of vulnerable people for her own financial gain. When Richard was arrested on formal charges of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and theft, the scene outside the police station resembled a major criminal case as dozens of community supporters gathered to witness his perp walk and ensure that the media captured every moment of his public humiliation. This arrest sends a clear message that elder abuse will not be tolerated in our community, announced Detective Lisa Morrison as she addressed the gathered media. Mr. Patterson used his position of trust to systematically abuse and rob a vulnerable elderly woman, and he will now face the full consequences of his criminal behavior. The sight of Richard being led away in handcuffs provided a sense of satisfaction for Katherine and the community members who had rallied around Dorothy's case. But everyone understood that the arrest was just the beginning of a long legal process that would determine whether justice would truly be served. The story dominated local news coverage for several days as reporters continued to investigate the broader implications of Dorothy's case and its impact on elder abuse awareness throughout the region. The Dorothy Patterson case has become a rallying cry for stronger elder abuse protections and more aggressive prosecution of family members who exploit elderly relatives, reported Channel 7's Sarah Chun during the evening news broadcast. Legal experts say this case could set important precedents for how similar cases are handled in the future, particularly when it comes to prosecuting financial exploitation and emotional abuse. The sustained media attention kept pressure on law enforcement and prosecutors to handle the case with the seriousness it deserved, while also educating the public about warning signs of elder abuse that might help prevent similar situations in other families. Michael, who had been the most reluctant participant in his brother's scheme, attempted to distance himself from Richard and Patricia by hiring his own attorney and expressing willingness to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. My client deeply regrets his involvement in this situation and wants to make amends for the harm that was caused to Mrs. Patterson, explained defense attorney David Chun during a press conference. Mr. Michael Patterson was manipulated by his older brother into participating in activities that he now understands were criminal and morally wrong. However, prosecutors made it clear that Michael's cooperation would need to include full testimony about the planning and execution of the abuse scheme, as well as complete restitution of any money or property he had helped steal from Dorothy. Back in the hospital, Dorothy was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from her community as flowers, cards, and gifts poured in from people who had been touched by her story and wanted to show their solidarity with her recovery. "Listen to this one, Grandma," Katherine said as she read from a card sent by a local elementary school class. "Dear Mrs. Patterson, we're sorry that mean people hurt you, but we're happy that Katherine came home to save you. We hope you feel better soon and that the bad people go to jail forever." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears as she listened to message after message from neighbors, friends, and complete strangers who had been moved by her story and wanted to help her heal from the trauma she had endured. "I never realized how many people cared about me," Dorothy whispered to Katherine. "All this time I felt so alone and forgotten, but now I see that I have a whole community standing behind me." The overwhelming support gave Dorothy strength for the legal battles ahead and hope that her suffering would lead to positive changes that could protect other elderly people from similar abuse. 6 months after Dorothy's rescue, the courthouse steps were packed with media representatives and community supporters as the criminal trial of Richard and Patricia Patterson began with intense public scrutiny and widespread demand for justice. Katherine walked arm in arm with Dorothy, who had made a remarkable physical and emotional recovery and was determined to face her abusers in court despite the trauma they had caused her. "I want to look them in the eyes when they're held accountable for what they did to me," Dorothy told reporters, her voice strong and clear. "For too long, I felt powerless and ashamed, but now I understand that I was the victim of calculated criminals who chose to prey on my trust and vulnerability." Attorney Martinez had prepared a comprehensive case that included medical evidence, financial records, witness testimony, and a viral social media documentation that had first brought the case to public attention. The courtroom was standing room only as Judge Patricia Williams called the case to order, with Dorothy's supporters filling every available seat, while Richard and Patricia sat at the defendant's table looking like shadows of their former selves after months of legal battles and social ostracism. The charges before this court represent some of the most systematic and callous elder abuse that I've seen in my 20 years on the bench, Judge Williams announced as she reviewed the extensive evidence that prosecutors had compiled. The defendants are accused of not only physically and emotionally abusing a vulnerable elderly woman, but of orchestrating a complex financial fraud designed to steal her life savings and family heirlooms. The formal reading of charges took nearly 15 minutes, as the court clerk detailed count after count of elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, theft, and conspiracy that painted a picture of calculated criminal behavior rather than simple family dysfunction. Dorothy's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case, as she described in her own words the systematic abuse and humiliation she had endured at the hands of people she had trusted completely. "They made me feel like I was losing my mind," she told the hushed courtroom, her voice steady despite the difficulty of reliving her traumatic experience. "When I questioned why my belongings were disappearing or why I was being forced to sleep under the stairs, they told me I was confused and forgetful. They used my age and my trust against me in the cruelest possible way. Dorothy's clear, detailed testimony destroyed any defense strategy based on claims that she had been mentally incompetent or had consented to the treatment she received. I may be 78 years old, but my mind is sharp, and I remember every day of the hell they put me through while my granddaughter was away. Prosecutor Jennifer Collins presented a devastating case that traced every aspect of Richard and Patricia's criminal scheme, using bank records, photographs, and witness testimony to prove that the abuse had been premeditated and systematic rather than the result of poor judgment or family conflict. Ladies and gentlemen of a jury, the evidence will show that the defendants spent weeks planning how to exploit Mrs. Patterson's temporary vulnerability while her granddaughter was away on business. Collins explained as she displayed financial records showing the rapid depletion of Dorothy's accounts. They didn't just steal her money and possessions. They stole her dignity, her security, and her peace of mind through a calculated campaign of psychological manipulation and physical neglect. The prosecutor's presentation included expert testimony from geriatricians who explained how the defendant's treatment could have led to Dorothy's death if Katherine had not returned when she did. The defense attorney's attempts to minimize their client's culpability fell flat as they struggled to explain away the overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse and theft that had been documented in excruciating detail. My clients made serious errors in judgment, but they never intended to cause the level of harm that resulted from their actions, argued Richard's attorney David Foster in a desperate attempt to avoid the most serious charges. They were attempting to help Mrs. Patterson manage her affairs, and the situation spiraled out of control due to miscommunication and family dysfunction. However, the defense's arguments were undermined by the clear evidence of premeditation, including the power of attorney documents that had been prepared before Katherine's departure and the systematic way that Dorothy's valuables had been cataloged and sold for cash. The jury's skeptical expressions made it clear that they weren't buying the defense's portrayal of the defendants as well-meaning family members who had simply made mistakes. Tyler's legal troubles escalated dramatically when a search of Dorothy's house during the investigation uncovered substantial quantities of illegal drugs that had been left behind after his parties, leading to additional criminal charges that carried their own serious penalties. Mr. Tyler Patterson is facing charges of drug possession with intent to distribute, as well as allowing controlled substances to be used on the property of an elderly person, announced Prosecutor Michael Davis during Tyler's separate hearing. The defendant used his grandmother's home as a base for illegal drug activities while she was being systematically abused and neglected by his parents. Tyler's arrogant demeanor from the weeks of partying had been replaced by genuine fear as he faced the possibility of several years in prison for drug-related offenses that were separate from, and in addition to, any charges related to the elder abuse case. After 3 days of testimony and less than 2 hours of jury deliberation, Judge Williams delivered the verdict that the community had been waiting for, finding Richard and Patricia guilty on all counts of elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, and theft. The jury has returned guilty verdicts on all charges, and this court agrees that the evidence presented was overwhelming and irrefutable. Judge Williams announced as gasps of relief and satisfaction rippled through the courtroom gallery. The defendants systematically abused a vulnerable elderly woman for their own financial gain, showing a level of callousness and greed that demands the most serious consequences available under the law. The sentencing phase would follow, but the guilty verdicts ensured that Richard and Patricia would face significant prison time and would be required to make full restitution to Dorothy for everything they had stolen and all the damages they had caused. During the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, Judge Williams imposed the maximum penalties allowed under state law, sending Richard to prison for 8 years and Patricia for 6 years, while also ordering them to pay over $200,000 in restitution and damages to Dorothy. The court finds that these crimes were particularly heinous because they involved the abuse of a family relationship and the exploitation of an elderly person's trust, Judge Williams explained as she announced the sentences. Mrs. Patterson welcomed these defendants into her home, believing they would care for her, and instead they subjected her to systematic abuse that could have resulted in her death. The sentences were met with applause from Dorothy's supporters in the courtroom, while Richard and Patricia sat in stunned silence as they realized that their greed and cruelty had cost them their freedom and their futures. Beyond the criminal penalties, Richard and Patricia's families faced complete social ostracism from their community as former friends, neighbors, and colleagues refused to associate with people who had been convicted of such systematic elder abuse. Patricia's book club expelled her from membership. Richard's golf buddies refused to play with him, and her children faced harassment at school from classmates who had heard about their parents' crimes. How can we trust people who would abuse their own elderly aunt for money? Asked former neighbor Jennifer Walsh when asked about the family's social isolation. If they would do that to Dorothy, who had always been kind to them, what would they do to the rest of us if they thought they could get away with it? The social consequences extended beyond just Richard and Patricia to include other family members who were seen as guilty by association, creating a lasting legacy of shame that would follow them for years to come. Outside the courthouse after the sentencing, Dorothy stood surrounded by the community supporters who had rallied to her cause, her face showing a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and renewed strength as she spoke to the media about the journey from victim to survivor. I never thought I would see this day when I was lying under those stairs feeling hopeless and abandoned, Dorothy told the gathered reporters, her voice clear and confident. But Katherine never gave up on me. This community never gave up on me, and the justice system proved that even elderly people have value and deserve protection from those who would harm us. Katherine stood beside her grandmother with obvious pride, knowing that their fight for justice had not only restored Dorothy's dignity, but had also created lasting changes in how elder abuse cases would be investigated and prosecuted in their community. This victory belongs to every elderly person who has ever been abused by someone they trusted, Dorothy concluded. Today's sentences send a clear message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated, and that there are people who will fight to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. 6 months after the sentencing that brought justice for Dorothy's suffering, the sound of laughter and gentle conversation filled the garden of Katherine's spacious suburban home, where Dorothy had found not just safety, but renewed purpose and joy in her golden years. "Grandma, should we plant the roses closer to the window so you can see them from your favorite reading chair?" Katherine asked as they worked together in the flower garden that had become Dorothy's new passion project. Dorothy's face glowed with health and happiness as she considered the question, her body having fully recovered from the malnutrition and trauma she had endured under Richard and Patricia's abuse. "I think that's perfect, sweetheart. Every morning when I wake up, I want to see something beautiful that reminds me how blessed I am to be alive and surrounded by people who truly love me." The peaceful domestic scene was a stark contrast to the nightmare Dorothy had survived, representing not just her physical recovery, but her complete emotional and spiritual healing. Katherine and Dorothy had channeled their traumatic experience into positive action by founding the Elder Protection Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating families about elder abuse and providing resources for victims who needed help escaping dangerous situations. "We want to make sure that what happened to me never happens to another elderly person," Dorothy explained to a room full of social workers, legal advocates, and family members during one of their monthly education seminars. "The warning signs are often subtle, and family members need to know what to look for and how to intervene before the situation becomes life-threatening." Katherine had used her business skills to build the foundation into a respected organization that worked closely with law enforcement, healthcare providers, and legal professionals to create a comprehensive support network for elderly abuse victims throughout the state. Dorothy's case had inspired significant changes in local and state legislation, leading to the passage of what became known as Dorothy's Law, which strengthened penalties for elder abuse and created new requirements for investigating suspected cases of family exploitation. This legislation will ensure that law enforcement and social services have the tools they need to protect elderly residents from the kind of systematic abuse that Mrs. Patterson endured, announced City Councilwoman Maria Rodriguez as she cast her vote in favor of the new ordinances. The law included provisions for mandatory reporting by healthcare providers, expedited court proceedings for elder abuse cases, and increased criminal penalties for financial exploitation of elderly people by family members. Katherine had testified before the city council and state legislature about the need for these changes, using Dorothy's story to demonstrate how existing laws have been inadequate to protect vulnerable elderly people from sophisticated abuse schemes. The Foundation's educational programs have been implemented in hospitals, senior centers, and medical practices throughout the region, training healthcare providers to recognize the subtle signs of elder abuse that might otherwise be overlooked or dismissed. Physical indicators like unexplained weight loss, dehydration, and unusual injuries are important, but we also need to watch for emotional signs like fear, withdrawal, and reluctance to speak freely about home situations, Katherine explained to a group of emergency room nurses during one of their training sessions. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had treated Dorothy during her hospitalization, had become a strong advocate for the Foundation's work. Katherine and Dorothy's educational programs have already helped us identify and report several cases of elder abuse that we might have missed in the past, she told her colleagues. Their work is literally saving lives and protecting some of our most vulnerable patients. Dorothy had found her calling as a peer counselor for other elderly abuse survivors, using her own experience to help them heal from trauma and rebuild their confidence and independence. I understand exactly what you're going through because I've been where you are, she told Margaret Thompson, a 75-year-old woman whose son had been stealing her Social Security check for over a year. The shame and confusion you're feeling are normal reactions to betrayal by someone you trusted, but I want you to know that it's not your fault and that you can recover from this. Dorothy's support groups have become an essential part of the Foundation's services, providing elderly abuse survivors with a safe space to share their experiences and learn from others who had faced similar challenges. Grandma has this amazing ability to help people see that they're not alone and that their lives aren't over just because someone hurt them, Katherine observed with pride. Dorothy had become a sought-after speaker at conferences and events focused on elder rights and abuse prevention, sharing her story with audiences across the country who were inspired by her transformation from victim to advocate. 1 year ago, I was lying under a staircase in my own home, feeling hopeless and forgotten, she told an audience of 500 social workers and legal professionals of the National Elder Justice Conference. Today, I stand before you as proof that elderly people are not disposable, that we have value and dignity that must be protected, and that we can overcome even the most devastating betrayals when we have people who believe in us. Her speeches never failed to move audiences to tears and action, generating donations for the Foundation and inspiring other communities to create their own elder protection programs. Dorothy's courage in sharing her story publicly has become a beacon of hope for elderly abuse survivors everywhere, said conference organizer Dr. Sarah Martinez. Katherine had been invited to teach guest lectures at local law schools about elder abuse prosecution and victim advocacy, helping to train the next generation of attorneys who would handle these sensitive cases. The most important thing you need to understand about elder abuse cases is that the victims are often reluctant to come forward because they're ashamed or because they still love the family members who are hurting them, she explained to a class of third-year law students. Your job as an attorney is not just to prosecute the criminals or represent the victims. It's to restore dignity to people who have had their humanity stripped away by those they trusted most. Her lectures had become so popular that the law school had invited her to develop a full-course curriculum on elder law and victim advocacy that would be offered as a regular part of their program. In an unexpected turn of events, Katherine had received a letter from Richard asking for a meeting at the state prison where he was serving his 8-year sentence, claiming that he wanted to apologize and make amends for the harm he had caused to Dorothy. I know that nothing I say can undo the terrible things I did to Aunt Dorothy, Richard said during their brief meeting, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by what appeared to be genuine remorse and humility. I destroyed my family, my career, and my future because of greed and selfishness, and I have to live with that knowledge every day. Katherine listened to his apology with skepticism, but also with a sense of closure, knowing that his acknowledgement of guilt validated everything she and Dorothy had fought for. I didn't come here to forgive you, Richard, she told him. I came here to see for myself that justice was served and that you understand the magnitude of what you did to someone who loved and trusted you." As the sun set over their garden, Katherine and Dorothy sat together sharing tea and looking through photo albums documenting their foundation's work and the lives they had touched over the past months. "Katherine, I need you to know that even though what Richard and Patricia did to me was horrible, I'm grateful for the path it put us on," Dorothy said, her voice filled with wisdom and peace. "We've been able to help so many people, and we've made changes that will protect elderly people for generations to come. That gives meaning to my suffering." Katherine squeezed her grandmother's hand gently, marveling at the strength and grace Dorothy had shown throughout their journey from victimization to advocacy. "You've taught me that love and courage really can overcome any evil, Grandma. Richard and Patricia thought they could destroy you, but instead they help you discover a strength and purpose that has changed hundreds of lives." As Katherine reflected on their incredible journey from that horrific night when she found Dorothy under the stairs to their current work protecting elderly people throughout the state, she felt overwhelming gratitude for the strength they had found in each other and the positive impact they had created from such devastating circumstances. Katherine often spoke to audiences about how their story began with her family's worst betrayal, but became a testament to the power of love, justice, and community support. She would tell people that if they were facing similar challenges, they should remember that evil only wins when good people do nothing. Katherine and Dorothy had become living proof that one person's courage to speak up can change everything. Where are you watching from today? Please leave a comment and let us know what this story meant to you. If it touched your heart or opened your eyes to the reality of elder abuse, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories that prove love and justice can triumph over the darkest circumstances.